good listeners. We're here with another episode of Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we share stories with you about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Back in January of 2026, I spoke with Dr. Mark Jantzen about the little-known history of Mennonites in Prussia. Mark is a professor of history at Bethel College in Kansas and the author of a book titled Mennonite German Soldiers, Nation, Religion, and Family in the Prussian East. He also finds time to co-direct the Mennonite Polish Studies Association. Here now is part one of our conversation. Welcome to Tales, Mark.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
I'm going to start off with a couple of basic questions to help situate our listeners in the context of our conversation. Where was Prussia in relation to modern-day map of Europe?
So if you're looking for Prussia on a modern-day map of Europe, you want to go to northern Poland, and you want to look for the city of Gdansk at the mouth of the Vistula River. That's kind of the main city of the geographic area of Prussia. But that area then runs all the way east and then goes up north and includes what today is the Kaliningrad Oblast. That's part of the Russian Federation. So it's kind of that whole sweep along the Baltic coast.
When did Mennonites begin to find themselves in Prussia?
Mennonites would have started showing up already in the 1530s from a variety of locations coming out of the Low Countries mostly, because there's a kind of a Dutch trading route from Amsterdam to Gdansk or Danzig. And some would have come out of Switzerland earlier and maybe went to Moravia and then end up further down the Vistula River. So they're coming from a variety of places starting in the 1530s, but the really big movement into Prussia would have been in the 1550s and 1560s.
Our historical knowledge of Mennonite life is largely shaped by their sojourn in Russia, even though they lived much longer in Prussia, and that's with a P, just so our listeners know we're talking about Prussia here. Is Prussian Mennonite history hiding somewhere?
Yeah, it'd be great if it's hiding, and we haven't found it. But I think the problem is more that when you think about 16th and 17th and even early 18th century history, there just aren't as many documents. And so there's not a lot of documents to find. People didn't write as much, and some of those records are lost. So there are records in Polish archives. You can find a lot of records, but it's not nearly as much as you get later on. And, of course, there's still church buildings and tombstones. There's material culture, but that doesn't tell you as much as the written documents.
What did a Mennonite community in Prussia look like? Did they live in colonies the way they did in Russia?
No. So Mennonite life in Poland was structured much differently than it would have been later in Russia. You know, when Mennonites arrived and settled, they settled amongst other people. So they never lived as compact as they did in Russia. And the way this would have worked, how did Mennonites kind of get there and get started, there would have been some recruiter working for a nobleman or a landowner, and where the Mennonites went in the Vistula Delta, a lot of that land was owned by the Polish crown. And so they would hire agents to populate that land and pay taxes on it. These recruiters, and sometimes they're Mennonite recruiters, and sometimes there are others who get Mennonites, and they're really just looking for Dutch people. So Dutch people come in, most of them are Mennonites, but not all. And they would kind of sign a group contract and get some land, and so you might have 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 farmsteads that are Mennonite, but all the ones surrounding that would be someone else. The villages are scattered farmsteads throughout the Vistula Delta region and the lowlands on either side of the river, and then administrators would just draw a circle around a number of farmsteads, 10 or 12 or 20, and designate that as a village. So when you drive through the villages, you can't really tell that it just looks like farmsteads. And there's no village center unless there's a church someplace, Catholic church or a Lutheran church, and stores would be just on somebody's farmstead. They had a little general store that they ran out of their farmstead. So it's a very different social structure than you'd find in Russia.
What about education? Did they have schools in churches at that time?
So at that time, we don't know a whole lot about their education. There were a few places in the 16th century where there's records of a Mennonite school in a village with a lot of Mennonites. There are other places where Mennonite kids would go to the village school if they had one with Lutheran kids or whoever else was in the village. So in the 16th and 17th century, we don't have a lot of good information about schools, but we know Mennonites sometimes did their own, sometimes shared with neighbors. And when they addressed higher officials and wrote in requests about education, they would request, we would like to be able to arrange education the way we want. And that will mean sometimes we'll have our own schools and sometimes we'll work with others, and we just want to have freedom of education. That was more fluid than you're used to later in Russia. They would work with others or not, depending on local circumstances.
You referenced farms, so they made their living off of agriculture primarily in Prussia?
So primarily it's agriculture, but there was always, going all the way back to the beginning, in Gdansk, or Danzig, and then the second city of the area would have been Elbing, or today it's Elbląg, and then the capital of Ducal Prussia, or what later became East Prussia, in Königsberg. So there's long-standing urban congregations where Mennonites are making their living off of business endeavors. In Gdansk or Danzig, they would have been involved in weaving, and they helped get the lace-making trade started there. And in Königsberg and in Gdansk, they also were involved in distilling and brewing and a variety of other trades. So there's actually a really long tradition of urban Mennonite life in Prussia, but it's a small percentage of the overall Mennonite community.
How did they acquire land for agriculture?
Yeah. So acquiring land was really complicated because in the part of Prussia where they mostly settled was called at the time Royal Prussia, and a lot of the land there belonged to the Polish crown. So the crown would appoint noblemen or administrators for crown estates, and Mennonites would sign leases and show up to take this land. But the land belongs to the crown, so you're not allowed to buy it. But if you're only renting from one year to the next, a renter's not going to invest. So their solution for that conundrum was to create a legal system that used inheritable leases. So you would buy into a lease with a substantial sum, and the lease would run 40 years. And you could sell that lease or pass it on to your heir. And if you built improvements on the land in those 40 years, you got credit for those improvements. You had to buy in again for another 40 years. Or if they didn't renew your lease, you got paid out for the improvements you made. So this set up a system where Mennonites could invest in their farms, treat it like they owned it, but they didn't technically own it. And so at the end of 40 years, they had to renegotiate those leases. In other places, if it wasn't on crown land or land with that kind of restriction, they could buy it outright. So some Mennonites owned land, and some had these really complicated inheritable leases.
What assumptions might one make about Mennonite life in Prussia that come from different periods of history?
Yeah, so when Mennonites are living in Prussia, that's a geographic area, but politically, they're in Poland. So Poland is a really large and complex state at this point. So starting in 1569, when the dynasty died out, they agreed to elect kings going forward. So they're in and they call it a commonwealth because it's not quite a kingdom because the king is always elected. And that gives the nobility, who have the votes for the king, more power and autonomy than they would have elsewhere. And the Catholic Church kind of has control of church life, but a lot of the nobility are Reformed, so they don't want to follow the Catholic Church. And then the cities that I mentioned in the north, Danzig, Elbing, and Königsberg, they're all Lutheran. And the cities control their own internal life, and they control some of the territory around them. So you have a really complex political dynamic where the king has some power, the nobility has some power, the Catholic Church has some power, the city has some power, and they always negotiate and shuffling who's in charge of what and how does this power play out. And then you have at least three major religions represented in those power structures, Lutherans and Reformed and Catholic. So there's a lot of moving parts in this system, and it's the moving parts that create the toleration for Mennonites. So in 1573, the nobility agreed not to hunt down and kill people of other religions. And officially they listed Lutherans and Reformed as Catholic, as tolerated.
And just so we're clear for our listeners, we know Lutherans, we know Catholics, who would be included under the Reformed umbrella at this point in time?
Yeah, so the Reformed movement started in Switzerland, but spread to the Netherlands and to Scotland. And so Reformed churches would have existed in those places. Today you'd find Reformed, like there's a Dutch Reformed church, it's called Christian Reformed. Presbyterian churches come out of this tradition. Baptists were influenced by Reformed but have some differences. So Reformed actually has a lot of footprint in the North American religious landscape. They weren't that large in Europe, but Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Scotland, plus a lot of nobility in Hungary and Poland and France were Reformed in the 16th century.
And we're talking about Anabaptists and Mennonites being outside of those three groups.
Yeah, they don't really count. But the Polish Commonwealth was huge. It extended far into modern-day Ukraine, modern-day Lithuania, Belarus, was all part of the Polish Commonwealth. So there's a lot of religions. They've got a few Muslims, a good number of Jews, Greek Catholics, Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox, Anabaptists, a few other small groups. So there's a lot more religious diversity in Poland than there would have been anywhere else in Central or Western Europe. So that created some space for Mennonites to exist there. And that's so that in the Holy Roman Empire, they're under a death sentence for being rebaptizers, as the officials would have called them. Adult baptism was a capital offense in the Holy Roman Empire. And they come to Poland, and they're like legal. And so it was a very attractive place for them to go in the 16th and even into the 17th century.
That was part one of my conversation with Dr. Mark Jantzen, an expert on Mennonite life in Prussia. The Mennonite Heritage Archives holds related materials such as immigration records for Mennonites moving from Prussia to Canada after World War II, microfilm of a number of Prussian Mennonite church registers, the Gerhard Wiebe diary from the late 1700s, and family genealogies. The Mennonite Heritage Archives was a co-sponsor of the 2026 John and Margaret Friesen Lectures at Canadian Mennonite University, where Dr. Jantzen presented lectures on the shifting national identities of Mennonites in Polish-German lands. What are you taking away from this show? Let us know by sending a comment via email to info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
Next week, we'll bring you part two of this conversation with Dr. Mark Jantzen, where he explains how the Prussian government targeted households headed by Mennonite women, and how this led them to leave Prussia. This is an episode you won't want to miss. Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein for their help with the show. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week. Thanks for listening.